I'm going to tell you the story of two brothers. And this is a story of Paul and John. So, Paul and John, they come from a very sad upbringing. And unfortunately, this is a story that we know all too well. We've seen it with our very own eyes. Paul and John, they were brought up in poverty, in an environment where there's gang violence and oppression and a lot of crime. Their father was a drunkard, and he'd beat up his wife and kids whenever he got drunk, which was almost every night. Their mother, on the other hand, wasn't that much better. She was a drug addict and would even sell her kids' toys to get more cocaine. Now, once they grew up, they ended up being very different, these two brothers. So let's look at John. John stayed in his hometown. He just stayed where he was, and he grew up to be a petty thief and a drug dealer. Paul, the other brother, on the other hand, he grew up and he became a successful New York investment banker. Now you may be wondering, how did this happen? How did it happen that these two brothers ended up so differently? We have John, who stayed in his area, who stayed in his city, and he ended up, just in the same path as his environment, the same path as his parents. He ended up doing crime, dealing in drugs, and remaining poor as he grew up. Well, Paul, on the other hand, he became a successful investment banker. So how did Paul become successful while John remained with his environment? Well, somebody asked, okay, so how did this happen? So they asked John, okay, how did this happen? How did you end up the way you are today? And he said, you know what? I grew up, my father was abusive, my mother was a drug addict. I had the people around me were criminals and drug addicts. And how could I have been any different? How could I have grown up any differently? This is the environment I grew up in. Well, when they asked Paul the same question, how did you end up this way? His answer was, my father was a drug addict. My father was a drunkard. My mother was a drug addict. I had this environment of crime and violence and drug addicts around me. And I saw it and I just knew I couldn't live like that. So how could I have ended up any different? And if you look at these two brothers, they had the same statement. They say, how could I have ended up any different in the situation that I grew up in? How could I, knowing that this is the environment, how could I have ended up in any different? John says, how could I have ended up any different? I had to stay the same. Paul says, how could I have ended up any different? I had to make a change. I had to do something that wouldn't keep me in this environment. And the reason I'm sharing this story with you is because we can't control what happens to us, right? We can't control what happens to us. Sometimes bad stuff happens. Sometimes good stuff happens. But what we can control is how we deal with the things that happen to us, how we deal with them, our own attitudes, our own behaviors, in response to bad or good situations. In a bad situation, you can be like John, who says, this is so bad, there's no way I can make my life any better. This is so bad that my life is so sad and I'm going to be like this forever. Or you can be like Paul, who says, this is so bad, I have to make a change to make sure my life is better from now on. So which one are you?